Telling a story isn't about perfection. It's about communication. It's about our shared moments together. Hi, my name is Jeff Price, and I would like to welcome you to Intentional Musicianship, where we look at everything that goes on at center stage and the preparation behind the scenes needed to transform your performance into an unforgettable experience. I am here to encourage you, support you, and generally have a great time being united together with you through music. After a wonderful performing career as a storytelling musician around the globe, my joy is found in empowering musicians to find the freedom to go beyond the music stand and the fourth wall of the concert stage to better engage with their audience members. This podcast isn't a classroom, it's a brainstorming session, and it is meant for musical performers of all ages. Together, we'll explore performance practice, stagecraft, the nuances of storytelling, and the strategies for genuine audience engagement. We're here to discover what truly makes a live performance resonate. Today, I'd like to look at a topic that you may not think of as much when you're getting ready to develop your musical performance. I want to talk about culture. And in this context, we're trying to figure out what the norms and the values that you hold, or your small group holds, or your greater organization holds, and figure out where you are and if it's ready to actually embrace or push through whatever you're currently doing to go and meet the vision that you might have for an even better, an even greater show. In today's show, I'll bring up some of my past experiences encountering various obstacles and ways we've tried to develop through those kind of things, and also look at being an audience member and almost what you can see from the vantage point looking up to the stage within a group. You can almost sense if the group is reticent to do something or if they're wanting to be like a worm larva change into that great caterpillar to butterfly kind of a moment. So let me start you out with a story about why I thought of this today. Now, as I go to events and I go to all these shows, it seems like each venue, each school, each group has a certain way that they do things. And these are the norms that make up who they are. Now, a lot of these things are just comforts that sort of come about over time. It's like part of our routine. And a lot of these things allow the groups, us as the audience member, to be grounded and be solid so that, we all have comfort. We have assurance about what's actually happening. It's like you don't want to rock the ship too much. You want to have a great experience. So I think when I started this podcast for Intentional Musicianship, one thing that drew me was this sense from the audience that those on stage wanted to do more for whatever reason. Somehow, though, there was a restriction, or unknowingly, the musicians on stage didn't know what to do to improve their show. And I think I've said on numerous occasions that if you show up and you make that extra effort to present this musical art form to others, we as the audience are going to really appreciate. We appreciate the value and the hard work and the dedication it took in that practice room to get what you were doing from, in your head to something tangible that we can hear on the stage. However, sometimes that's just not enough as the musician, and you want to explore the limits and boundaries of your culture and what you're going through and what you're willing to do to find opportunities in which you could connect with the audience more, where you could push the limits of your bandmates and your accompanists so that you can improve your performance practice, your stage presence, your storytelling, to have that better communicative experience on the stage, something that sort of sets you apart. So this leads me to talk about a concert I just went to, and it was the very first concert of a local community band group. And the performance was really stunning for a first-time event. The programming was excellent. The musicianship was excellent. The sections were full of a very balanced instrumentation. There was a definite buzz in the community, and all of us in the audience were really appreciative. In fact, It was an early arriving crowd, and the doors were open an hour prior. I walked in 45 minutes, and the house was already 2/3 full. And so you could tell it was going to be a great evening. Now, one takeaway that I took from that group was what they were trying to achieve on that given night. Because it was a first-time event, and they were focused on presenting themselves well to the community for this very first time. And they focused on the basics. And their basic that they focused on was being as musically excellent and solid as they could for that initial show. They were just taking those initial steps that happens with a group. And when I think of a group and I think about the development, I have something I've sort of learned about over time. It's that you form the group, then you storm because you're getting to know one another. It's a little uneasy and you're sort of going through the rain together, and you get to know one another and you develop, and then you start to norm. So you form, you storm, you norm, where you're coming together and you know each other, and then you finally get it and you're performing. And you can tell within this group that they had achieved many of their initial goals. And you could see the road that they have ahead of them in the future in this area as an ensemble and as they develop as an ensemble. Now, at this point, as they focused on the basics, they had the show order, they had the program, they generally felt very comfortable where everybody was. There were a couple choreographed segments. For example, in one of the first pieces, a piccolo player had to walk off stage in order to sell the particular piece. And then she came back on to applause at the end. But some of these cultural norms and things as they were developing, well, there was no talking. There was no engagement with the audience in any way, except for just the bows at the end of each selection. Now, this isn't a negative in any way, except that you could tell what their focus was. And we as the audience, we were just pretty doggone amazed at the sound that was coming off those stage from the people that we live and work with every day. I think there was another time during the concert, there was an unexpected audience reaction. It's like in the middle of a piece, multi-movement piece, and the audience naturally clapped. And the conductor adeptly turned around and acknowledged the applause as well. It was interesting because we had multiple conductors. We had multiple people, multiple levels of musicianship from the community. As an HR nerd and someone that works in HR all the time, you could really see this musical group like the workplace. There were 5 generations of musicians on stage, and each musician, they think and they do things differently because sometimes the generational difference. So as part of that forming, storming, norming, and performing, you could tell everybody coming together, and they weren't quite ready to sell themselves as a brand yet because they were making the debut. Yet it was almost like that achievement came about because when they hit the stage and they heard the audience, they just knew that they had a hit on their hands. Now, some interesting things about the program, because I nerd out and I critique. And basically, if you ever see me at a show, I usually have a notebook, or sometimes I'll be talking into my iPhone. And it's not so much I'm critiquing to critique or improve the group, but I want to remember what was happening and the emotions of the audience and what I was taking in. But because I've been doing this a long time and you're trying to figure out where they are culturally, I saw opportunities. It was interesting because the group was connected as a joint venture with a local university. It was a first of its kind. It was incredible. It took the small music program within that local university and made it bigger by adding the community. But it was completely different in character than the university band. And you could see that as this group develops, there'll be a lot more connections and talking and engagement. Now, in the program, they let the program sort of do the talking for themselves to have that real quick, effective way to communicate with everybody. Really nice program. Even had links that you could donate to the group or the school. You could really see, though, there was an opportunity within the nesting of those programs and the welcome saying, this is our first time here, which didn't happen, but we all knew it. That's why we were there. I think that's why there was such a buzz. And it was an opportunity that we could have been talked to and said, here's what we envision, and this is what we see. And it wouldn't have been like a board meeting where you would just pepper anybody for 5-10 minutes at a time, but somehow nicely nested through. And I know this will probably develop through time, that they'll nest these things like the donations and how to support the group and where the group is playing and how you can get involved and how you can participate. And that'll be part of just that natural evolution of their culture and the development of a group, that form, storm, norm, and perform. However, a lot of these things just weren't in the cards yet for what they wanted to achieve. Now, many people in the group might have aspirations to do many of these things from the start. I know I'm like an idea fairy and I want to be the best I can right now. But as you can see from this podcast, it's one of growth. It's one of development. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to be about it. And so if you see me and you engage me and we have our 15-minute calls to just talk about anything you'd like to with music, we sort of take an assessment and we figure out who you are and where you want to go. And it's a lot easier than saying you're in a 60-member group and you're trying to turn the ship. It's like, that cruise ship only has that small way to steer the ship and direct that ship, and it turns very slowly. Of course, I'm old. I'm thinking of the old, is that Speed 2 where they had Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had to figure out what to do with the cruise ship. There's only certain ways to turn a ship, and it takes some time. I know there are people in the group that have aspirations to do even more, but at the right time and the right place, they'll do it. And I know it will happen because I have former students in the group, and I know that they like to be engaged with the audience just like I like to be engaged with the audience. They're proud audience members as much as they like to play. But as that group develops, they're going to figure out where they want to go, and they're going to figure out those norms, that cultural thing that everybody can link to. And I think sometimes in the culture of a group, sometimes the best we can do, and sometimes we just have to know who we are and when to rock the boat. And at some point, the leaders of that ensemble are going to have, they'll develop some narration. Maybe they'll have someone in that group that has strength in that area to give that narration. Maybe you're going to have someone who really likes to be the stage manager for the group. And it was interesting because of, the culture of that particular new group. It was different than the university band that has this Kappa Kappa Psi, this band honorary that's one of the largest campus groups at this small college. And when those Kappa Kappa Psis are involved with the college group, they're very engaged with their personality, with ideas and zest. And some of that's culture and that's the engagement, but they're always engaged about the music selection and subtle things they want to do on stage and how to connect with that audience. And so you can see that's going to naturally come up as that group develops. And again, as I looked, just like we have 5 generations in the workplace, we have 5 generations of working musicians in this community ensemble. And it really is cool for that forming, storming, norming, and performing to see where they were on a given night. And they were just finding their way to give a great show. And it is truly a delicate balance when you're trying to start something and you have some people wanting to do this and some people want to do that. But, a lot of people just wanted to be part of something and get their instruments out. And so they really have to figure out what buttons to actually push within this kind of group. Hey, I know I was in the military, and I know that when you even push things too hard there was mass rebellion because people are people, and there are norms and there are societal ways to do things the correct way and ways just not to do them as well. Now, what I saw of this community band is not a rare thing. I've seen many college groups, high school groups, wind ensembles, symphonies, professional wind bands in the military. They all have these kind of thoughts and struggles depending on the instrumentation of the group, the leadership of the group, the vision of the group, what they're trying to accomplish in any particular season. And sometimes, that leads them to focus on one particular area of performance practice or stage presence or storytelling. Recently, one of the other local ensembles went and did this college band directors association thing. And so they were really focused on selling what they had learned at the university and how that program has developed over time. And it was a great legacy program. As a proud alum, it was awesome to watch. I got to watch it on a live stream. I think it was Vimeo is what had it. And it was really cool. But they sold things through the performance because that was a particular kind of event. Now, I was fortunate to be in a group with a great culture. And I was in one of the United States' last touring wind ensembles, and that's called the United States Army Field Band in Washington, D.C. Now, I joined way back in 1996. And there were established norms of this group that had predated my entry into the group and still live on past me. And it was everything from how we loaded into a particular location. Boy, we love gyms because they're the easiest load in and load out. We knew when the doors were going to be opened for the concert, when the performers would come on stage and how we'd warm up, what were our norms and expectations. When we'd leave the stage, then that would be 15 minutes prior to the downbeat. When we come back on 5 minutes before the downbeat for that final tuning note to let everybody in the audience to know we're ready, then the conductor would come on stage, we'd stand, and then we'd start into the show. Everything from the tone of the narrator, the order of the music, the styles performed were all things that were part of that established tone or culture of that group. And it was very successful. There were certain ways in which, we had the instrumental soloist in this slot. We had the vocal solo in this slot. We had the choral package in this particular slot. We had a popular music package in this particular slot. We had encores done in a particular way to sell the army, to sell the ensemble, to sell the soloists, how we could bring people back onto the stage, how we would greet people after the concert, how we would load out, get on the buses, and go back to the hotel. I learned a lot of things from that group, and it shaped me as a musician. And I imagine wherever you're planted, you're growing to be your best and you're being shaped as a musician as well. Hopefully that's why you're listening. As things continue over time, things always change a little bit and new ideas are introduced. And so it's funny when I think about the field band, I left in 2006 after my hand injury and recovery to become a warrant officer. Now, I was called back in to be a sub because one of the saxophone section had a knee injury on a tour. And in that middle of the tour, they were supposed to be the featured band at the American Bandmasters Association. And that's a really cool concert. You get to play with a lot of distinguished conductors, and there's a new conductor for every piece. And it sort of showcases the group and the conductors. And it's just a really nice, fun event. And this was down in Florida, and it was a really cool thing. So I flew down to Florida from the Army School of Music, where I was stationed as a young Army warrant officer and bandmaster. And it was a fun event. I went down, Delta lost my uniform. So a young lieutenant shared with me his uniform until they found my uniform. And so that particular first concert, I was in his uniform, but for some reason I had my right rank shoulder boards that I put on. And I was fortunate that Lieutenant Kinsey at the time still was generally my size and I could fit into the uniform. And after that concert, I remember going down to Key West, and that was the next stretch of the tour. And it was fun because as a new warrant officer, I was checking things out from a different perspective. And I was being mentored by the leader of the field band at that time, who I had known when he was the commandant of the School of Music, Colonel Tom Palmatier. And he was a visionary Army musical leader, very systematic in his approach to things. And he brought the field band a more precise explanation of their culture. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to just knowing and doing, he wrote down, put in systems, and they did what was on the paper. They had to change their cultural norms and expectations because now it was written out, and they had specific meetings. And before shows, they had meetings with key personnel about what marks to hit and what was going to happen and the expectations and what and how things were prepared for that evening. If there were anything special setup issues, and everybody to the letter knew the whole system of what was happening. And it was an interesting change of pace because, within that rank system and the culture of the Army, everyone had to adapt and change. But you could tell as everything, even if it was a great idea, that sometimes, it was maybe sometimes a little formulaic because, sometimes some of those members were just going through the motions because, hey, I've been doing this a lot longer than you, and I'll be here after you. But however, I'm going to do what you ask because you're the boss, that kind of thing. And it was neat. The group was still awesome, but that culture, within that, you're trying to figure out what that buy-in is. You got to get those early initiators, and then those more people adapt, and more people adapt, and get those late adopters. So you only have a very small percentage, if any, that haven't adapted. You got to get everybody to swing in. And sometimes that's hard to do when you're changing culture. It takes a lot of finesse to get that buy-in to the change and development. Now, within the Army, it was interesting, and this might have been Colonel Palmateer's doing too. They hired a guy named Tom Jackson. And very similar to what I learned in the field band and from Colonel Palmateer, is this guy is a live music producer. His whole job is to get you to look great and be on stage. He's the guy you want. He's fantastic. I love following him on YouTube. I love watching different videos or seeing his blog posts. I have his book. I've been to many sessions as the Army trained with him for many years. And he's absolute genius into trying to build groups and their stage presence. And one of the things he does talk about is like, okay, so I just talked about a lot of things you could do. Once we get done with this session, what are you willing to do? And I think that's pretty interesting because everything he did was nothing different than what that colonel had said or what I had walked into in 1996 or what even those previous college bands with John Painter at Northwestern or Don Wilcox at West Virginia University or Keith Reed at Morgantown High School had ever done with me. Everybody had that same goal of communicating well with the audience, connecting with that crowd. Now, as stated before, and even as an example on the community band show, there's a lot of truth to, take our performance, our showmanship, our musicianship to that next level. It becomes real difficult. And so we really have to look at ourselves and try to be more deliberate and try to think of that cause and effect of what we're doing. In some ways, we really are pressing the limits of our comfort to make sure that we're trying to communicate successfully and to get our points across to that audience. In some ways, it's like any relationship. Relationships take work. And depending on where you want that relationship to go and how you want that relationship to develop, you have to figure out how to press and engage and develop. Now, further on, I remember going to San Antonio, and I was the executive officer of a small, maybe it was medium Army band. We were growing in size. And Bob Arnold was a great arranger and horn player then, been in the Army for many years as a musician. Now it's funny, he's retired and he's actually a locomotive engineer. And that's really cool because I grew up around trains up here in West Virginia. Now, he would always design our shows, and because he was a great arranger and had all this experience, and he had learned over the years in all these wonderful military musical groups, things very similar to what I had learned. It didn't just come from nothing. There's a way, the reason why a lot of the things that you do on stage is done because it was successful. And those are the cultural norms like we were talking about. But one thing that I really liked about how he ran things and how we were pushing things with the Tom Jackson and modernization of the Army music program, we were getting all of our musical groups engaged on any given show at one time. We'd be very modular. Was we did a lot of technical rehearsals. And this is one of those things, it wasn't a dress rehearsal, it was a tech rehearsal. Now, sometimes we did do a dress rehearsal, which is just a run through of the show, but this technical rehearsal was really important. And I think most musicians, except for me, because I'm a geek, they'll cringe at this technical rehearsal thought that you're going through. And even different than that oral meeting that we had with Colonel Palmatier and going through everything, it was then going out and hitting our specific marks like we were in a theater or a theater show. And we were going through in real time and we're trying to make sure that everything worked. We're trying to make sure that when we read through scripts and we stood up and we bowed, that we could see and feel that reaction that could happen. And we would try to figure out how to adapt if things weren't going well, or, making sure that all the page turns were in such a way so that it didn't distract from the show, what to do at the end of the pieces. And those were very involved rehearsals. But we got pretty doggone good. So good, in fact, we wanted to take this on the road because we spent a lot of time baking this extra cake. And so around a year later, we were the featured Army band up at the School of Music at this special Army band leader training. And we had everything. We brought all the video concepts that we had placed in with a lot of hellos from all the soldiers around the world deployed in harm's way. And engaging musical pieces and PowerPoint presentations. I remember calling Stevie Vai on the phone and getting a copyright to a really awesome guitar piece of his that we arranged for band. And then consequently, Army bands can now use it to this day completely for free because he was so wonderful and gifted it to us. And it was great because we worked on so many concerts over that time as we developed in the segues and how we transitioned to different musical performing units with those videos of all these soldiers. And so that we could feature all of our smaller ensembles, our rock bands, our show band, our Latin band. And we did this within our Army modernization instructor that was going on at that time. And I know everyone was real proud if we look back at what we accomplished, but it took time. And boy, a lot of that was just grueling. And there were times like we were going through that tech rehearsal. I remember sometimes the way the culture worked, sometimes you had the first sergeant and the first sergeant and the sergeant major. They're sort of like the union bosses of the group. And they'd be the ones that sort of led the group for a majority of the time. They set the brakes on things. We say, no, we need a break now. Hey, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. This is all you're going to get from us today. They were that last line of defense for the musicians to make sure that things would go smoothly, so that the leaders wouldn't be too crazy with ideas and push past the norms. And so the senior leader of that band, the commander, was Doug Parman, a great mentor of mine. And I remember Steve Mohasey would just send me away, say, hey, let's run through this together. We're going to run through it without anybody here. We're going to get it all fixed, and then we'll call the boss down. And those rehearsals, a lot of them were outside because we were down in San Antonio getting ready for outside shows. So we were practicing like we were performing. And there was just a lot of nuance in everything we did. And we developed a great culture because of that, a new culture, a culture that was engaged on our audience. And we wanted to represent the American soldier in a more effective way. We wanted to connect with the audience in a more effective way. One of the cool things about San Antonio is we had a huge warrior transition unit there. And we had the Center for the Intrepid, which was all the burn injuries. And so that kind of acute care that was there and what was going on in the country, this was around 2009 with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it gave our music a message, and we felt compelled to change to develop a better product. Now, I think depending on where you are and what kind of group you're in, you might want to figure out what you can do at this moment to make those changes and what your culture can actually take. And so, as I've talked about, maybe you've seen, some of the basics are that fundamental musicianship. Everybody knows their part. You have a nice program, a nice order. You're going to have to storyboard, and you're going to have to figure out, when that house opens, what the musicians do beforehand, what's going to be on stage with you and your instruments. I remember one failed attempt at culture was trying to get very minimalistic on stage. And at one point, one of the conductors said, "We don't want to have water on stage." Now, we had never had water, and then all of a sudden, because of culture, water became very prevalent on stage. And it was hard to take it back. But the main thing we ended up getting off the stage at that time, this is probably in the field band in the 97, 98. I think sometimes people would bring their purses out or something as part of their bags for all their reeds and stuff. We had a little bit too much of that. So we had to fix those kind of things. Those are the kind of things, as you figure out, how you greet your audience, the key points in the show, the highs, the lows, where the mic placement is, where the standing is, all that tech stuff. You got to figure out what your culture can handle. And if something can't be handled, you're going to probably have to go back. I've had a lot of failures within that kind of thing where you're trying to push the limits of, can we do this? And the musicians will say, "I don't like it. I'm not going to do it." And at that point, you got to bail water and get out of it. Sometimes, let's say one of my mentors at Doug Parman I was talking about, we knew it was a good idea that if we came up with it in 6 minutes, 6 months later, 6 months later, we knew that the culture had changed and it was going to be a good thing if the musicians then brought up the same idea we brought up 6 months prior. We couldn't make that change yet. But 6 months in, slow, gradual growth, if the musicians came up and built consensus for that change, it was way better than all the failures I had as a boss trying to tell people what to do versus the musicians coming up with consensus and saying, "We'd like to make this change." And sometimes, within your norms, you just got to figure out what you can do and be successful within your own sphere. Every group is different. My folks in Alaska had particular ways that they wanted to do things. There were particular cultural norms in Alaska that were expectations for various shows, especially on different repeated events we would do annually. There were expectations from our sponsors about what would happen. I remember being in Kansas, and there were cultural norms and things that were in Kansas. Same thing. I remember doing that same kind of a modular show at the Kansas Music Educators Association, but we were including Kansas music educators with it. And it's just a lot of fun to grow together as musicians and figure out where we can grow as a team. So wherever you are in this journey, I recommend sitting down, writing it out, talking it through with the people you trust, with the group of musicians you're playing with, whether it be your accompanist, maybe your small group, your bigger ensemble. Maybe you have your section or your woodwind group or the brass group, percussion group. Try to figure out what you can do within your established group norms that you can do to engage more effectively. You're pretty much going to be your best wherever you are. You're going to have to go with the flow a lot of the times. You got to be the best you can and make the group you're in the best it can be. And your group is always the best in the entire world because you're the one in it and you're driving the train and your personal growth and you're important and your music's important. And so that's a really cool thing. I sort of visualize that. Yeah, I'm not trying to be so narcissistic, but I had a great boss, General Funk, and one of his rules is the unit you're in, make it the best. And so in the same way, in the band you're in, the group you're in, you make it the best. And hey, you're the best because I'm coming to spend time to come and see you. I'm the audience member. And I think you're pretty doggone cool. I think you're pretty special. And in the end, you're going to hit your mark. You're going to hit your cues. and you're going to do what you can to help, and you're going to help communicate that message to others, and you're going to form and storm and norm and perform like no one's ever seen. You wonder how those great groups got to that apex in their playing. They started with that first rehearsal, and then that first genesis of a new idea, and then they put it on the show, and they saw how it worked, and they developed it some more, and they did it some more. Some things went viral, some things went away. But in the end, they persevered, they developed, and they became special. And that's what you are. And I wish you the best in your development as a group, as an ensemble, as you look at this thing called culture. That's it for today's episode. We hope that some of the topics and issues addressed today will be useful to you as you move forward in your musical journey. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for joining us today. We know your time is precious, and we really appreciate that you have taken the time to listen to us today. Consequently, we'd like to hear from each and every one of you. You can reach out and connect with us at intentionalmusicianship.com. My hope is that we build a community where we can encourage one another through our mutual experiences performing live music. I look forward to connecting with each of you again on the next episode of Intentional Musicianship.